anything specific he'd like you to say introducing him? He said, no, just say, here's Yaz. So I'll do that now that I've said some other things. But check out his bio there, and you want to read through that. And with that, here's Yaz.
Okay, thank you. Everybody hear this okay? We good? Now, you'll find out that during my presentation, I'm nowhere near as threatening as this guy. And I'm not going to come in your face and beat an answer out of you. I'm here to talk about worms, basically. And I brought Dr. Tucker, Chris Tucker. He's our entomologist in the department. He's going to talk just a little bit on flies because I need to give them a little bit of the stage also. And I thank you all for coming to listen to these talks, and also to whoever invited me here. Thank you very much for inviting me in this proceedings. A couple disclaimers. We're still at the University of Arkansas, so the University of Arkansas, as well as me and Tucker, do not endorse any product, person, or parasite mentioned in this presentation. I'm down on all the drugs. Not quite as down as this guy is, but I'm down on a lot of on most of the drugs. And I'm very high on the worms. Worms have been doing great over the last 3-4 decades, and the wormers just haven't been keeping pace with them. So there's our predilection as to what we like and what we don't like. But whatever product you think is working for you, I recommend keep on using it, but do yourself the favor of seeing if it's working. Because these worms, unlike the ticks, unlike the flies, unlike the external parasites, they hide from you. So you can be wasting an awful lot of money using medications that ain't working and just losing due to subclinical disease that you're not addressing. That's the bottom line of my presentation, basically. So we don't endorse anything, and we don't badmouth anything. We just say if it works or not. Okay? Another disclaimer. Here's where Tucker finds himself on the animal. He's on the outside. He does flies, basically, his research. Plus, he helps me in doing internal parasites. Me, I'm at the tail end of the animal, getting those fecal samples, looking for eggs, growing those eggs into larvae, killing animals, getting the worms out of them. And that's where I've been for the last 50 years of my life, right there at the back end of the animal or inside the animal, looking at the eggs and looking at the worms. The majority of the work being done today in the United States is at the DNA level and beyond, relative to finding out what these worms are all about at the DNA level. Because if you find out what anything is doing at the DNA level, ultimately you have a key to controlling that particular pathogen. But we work here, and a lot of the work being done today is beyond the level that we're looking at. So the overall take-home of this presentation, we are what we eat, but for cattle, they are what the parasites don't eat. All the worms, I guess there's a little bit of lungworm still out there, but basically all the worms that cattle get live inside the intestinal tract or in the liver. So that animal doesn't get any food unless the parasite allows that food to get past them. So what they leave is the animal you have left behind. The more parasites you grow, the less cow you grow. I mean, it's just a one-to-one correlation between the two. You can't grow a bunch of good worms and also grow a bunch of good cows out there. None of the wormers are as good as they used to be. None of them. We have not had a new medication for worm control in the last 25 years. 25 years gone by. We have not had one new medication passed in the United States for controlling worms. And all that time, the last 25 years, every time you treat for worms, you are selecting for the resistant worms. You've been doing it for 25 years in a row. Killing the easy worms and allowing the healthy worms to continue on. So that's what we're dealing with today, is worms that basically laugh at us when we use products to control them. Your cattle always have worms. It's just a matter of putting a lid on their impact. There's no way of completely cleaning your animals and keeping them clean, because they're living in the habitat of the worm. The worm lives on that pasture, in that pasture. So until we start putting our cattle in cages like chickens and guinea pigs, we're going to have worms in these animals at all times. It's just a matter of keeping those worm levels down to a level that they're not taking an awful lot of money out of your pocket. You're going to lose some money, obviously, but not, you want to put a lid on it. Okay, the effective parasitism of the animal, or how important at your bottom line is the parasitism of the animal, it's a factor of all these things put together. It's the amount of parasites in the animal, the amount of parasite challenge that animal is facing at all times, every day of the year in this part of the world, worm-wise, the animal's resistance to those parasites, the stress you have on that animal, the more stress you have on the animal, the better the parasites and any pathogen will do. The genetics of the animal, are they resistant, somewhat resistant to worms or not? You go out into any herd, long-standing herd, 80% of your worms will be in 20% of your animals. 80% to 20%. If you can figure out that 20% and just sell them to your neighbor, you're going to do a lot better than any drug you can use. 20% of your animals will have 80% of your worms. So there's an awful lot of individual variation relative to susceptibility to worms. And also, there's genetics at the worm side. How many genes do these worms have for resistance? They only need one gene to be resistant to levamisole. They only need one of 3 genes to be resistant to the benzimidazoles. It looks like they need about 20 genes of resistance in order to get resistant to the macrocyclic lactones. And that's why they still have some effect. Even though we've overused them and adulterated the use of those macrocyclic lactones, it's incredible that they are still working at all after this period of time. So the genetics. I'm already spending too much time on it. That's another thing. I went through this talk 5 times. Each time I cut it down, and I still brought enough slides to talk to you for 3 days. But I'm going to keep it to the 45 minutes. I figure a little bit of exposure at your level is better than no exposure. So I'm just showing you the kind of stuff that's out there. Okay, the genetics, the animal nutrition, the better the nutrition, obviously, the more resistant the animal is going to be to the parasites. Any controls you have on that parasitism, in addition to the drugs, that will help out. And the demands you have on that animal. What does that animal have to do for you? If it's doing nothing for you, then heck, you don't care how many parasites are there. But if you need a calf out of it, if you need milk out of it, you need meat from it, obviously there's going to be less of that because of the worms that you have in that animal. Okay, the cattle operation, the categories that determine the treatment timing and the need for parasite control. There's a whole bunch of different categories you can put farms and animals in that kind of indirectly or directly dictate how wormy these animals are and how often they need treatment. Dairy farms, confinement, adult animals, they don't have any worms. Okay, obviously. They have to eat worms, and worms can only live for about 3 to 7 months. So if you keep them off grass for 3 to 7 months, you're all done with worms. Pastured animals, replacement dairy animals, they have the biggest worm burns I've ever seen. Replacement dairy animals. These dinky little susceptible Holstein calves you put in this dinky little pasture right next to that dairy operation. They've been seeded down with worms for the last 40 years. And those worms are just waiting for that next crop of susceptible Holstein animals. If I do a drug study, I get Holsteins or Jerseys. Worms love those animals because there's really no good immune response in those animals to the worms. Beef animals, grazing versus confined. If they're grazing on grass, they're going to have worms. If they go in the feed yard, you're done with worms. So hence, you want to use a pretty good drug when they get to the feed yard, because after they get to the feed yard, they're not going to get worms anymore. There are a few worms that can get into cattle boring through the skin. There's 3 different worms, but the majority of worms that get into the cattle, they get into the cattle via the ingestion of the grass. Additional statuses, regular farms, natural farms, organic farms. There's that implication as to how often you treat and what you treat with. And beef animals, cow-calf operation determines when you treat and when you don't treat. You get a spring calving, you get a fall calving. Arkansas, you calve whenever, okay? I'll get, at the end of my talk, I get into when I suggest deworming animals in beef operations, and lactation and parturition has an awful lot to do with good timing for worms, because that's when the worms have the greatest impact on the adult animal. But I'll get into that later. Size of the operation. Generally speaking, the smaller farms have more parasites, because the smaller farm, the more they like to pack animals in, the higher the stocking rate. The higher the stocking rate, the more worms. And the kind of categories you have for farm sizes, small, you can stand in one place and see all your cattle. That's a normal farm in Arkansas. Also normal, stand in 4 different places, and then you'll see all your animals. We got places in the United States that are big. You have to helicopter for 4 hours or so and hope you see all your animals. I've given talks in Florida and Texas where I say you want to worm out your mama cows when they freshen. And the 2 comments I get was, it takes us 3 months to bring our cattle in, some of these operations. So they ain't going to do it. And people down in Texas that got these big operations say, if you can't show me 3% improvement in my animals with any deworming, I ain't bringing them up. Because I lose 3% of my animals just bringing them up. So helicopter rides or helicopter chasing. Stalker and backgrounder, which is evidently is what this meeting is about, where the worm control is the most problematic and impossible. That is where you concentrate animals for short periods of time. You give a lot of treatment. You get a lot of worms. Most of the worms are there, and most of the resistance is there. So that is where it's the hardest to control worms. Feedlot, there's a lot of peripheral assistance there. When you get cattle at the feed yard, you treat them, and hopefully they're okay. But I think, and the more I look at it, and I look at it every so often, that just that change in diet that you give an animal at that feed yard probably kills more worms than any anthelmintic they use at the feed yard. And purebred, they're usually people that are most in tune with how to control the worms in their animals. Okay, nice looking cow. Then what we see when we see that cow, that's what the parasites see. Whole bunch of hotels, whole bunch of restaurants. Worms live in their food. Okay, that intestinal tract is their food. They have harbor there. They have protection there. They are protected from the environment. Inside the intestinal tract, they're also basically protected from the immune response of the animal. And that's a great place to eat and great place to have their young come out in the feces, spread it out on that grass so that you know for sure your progeny is going to get back into these animals. Great place to be. Okay, the pathogenesis of worms, what they're all about. The two major reasons why we treat for worms, anorexia, lack of appetite, and reduced feed efficiency. Those are two major direct adverse effects that worms have in our animals. And everything else kind of just spills from there. We have reduced productivity. I don't care what you're producing. If you got worms, you're producing less of it. Intestinal inflammation, that's what worms do. Worms make the intestinal tract of cattle just like your nose when you get a cold. All that congestion, all that inflammation happens in the intestinal tract when you got worms. And if you have an inflamed intestinal tract, that intestinal tract is not digesting food. It's not absorbing food. It's just passing right out. And the worms love that stuff. They love to have nice congested tissue. Blood, fluid, tissue loss, reduced and redirected immune response. They've shown that the more worms you have, the less allergies you have, and also the less you control viruses because it skews the immune response. Plus it fatigues the immune response. You got tens of thousands of worms inside that cow's intestinal tract. All that foreign protein being exposed to the animal, the immune system can't sort all that out and say, well, these aren't important. It just tries to get immune to all of that. So the immune system is working like crazy when there's worms in the intestinal tract. Altered activity of the animal, mainly with the external parasites. Here's the parasites that we have that are important. These are the worms. Bunch of them. There's generally about 12 different species of worms you have inside the intestinal tract. I could talk for 2 days on each of those in my parasitology class. Those are the round worms. You also have tapeworms. That's a major tapeworm that we have in cattle. Here's flukes that we have in the United States. Here, from what I gleaned by reading, although you haven't had too often many cattle parasitologists come in and out of Kentucky. You guys are eminent worldwide in Kentucky and Tennessee with horse parasitologists, but you're neglecting your cattle. That's just my personal opinion. And you get the regular liver fluke here. You don't have the deer. You don't have the deer fluke, and you don't have the lancet fluke. That's what you got, and you got plenty of it. The external parasites, the horn fly, the face fly, the sable fly, hypoderma grubs. You guys still have grubs? That's one. You got grubs, really? Okay, because usually you go around a cattle operation and say, "Heck's a grub." I asked the guy at the feed yard, sees tens of thousands of cattle a month. So how's your warble? We said, what the hell's a warble? And it's just things you don't see anymore. The ivermectins did really well wiping out the warbles, but you got grubs in your cattle, big knot, cavernous knots, blisters. This guy's saying no. Okay, I'd be surprised if you do. Wyoming still has them. Nebraska still have them. For some reason, it's been pretty much cleared out of here. Lice and ticks. I'm not going to talk about protozoan parasites, trichomoniasis, Neospora, Eimeria, the cocci. Not going to talk about them. Just talk about worms and the external parasites. The most important parasites that are routinely, efficaciously removed with standard anthelmintic treatment. Nothing. There's so much resistance today, and there's no new drugs in the United States. You can't effectively kill 90% of your worms with a routine treatment today if you're in a cow business, sheep, goat business, chicken business, turkey business. All those parasites are resistant to the drugs we have. Reason being, worms are basically subclinical. They steal from your pocketbook. They generally don't steal from what you see out there on the grass. Okay, now it's time for Dr. Tucker to come up here. We're gonna give these flies 5 minutes. He gets 5 minutes to talk about some face flies and horn flies that we have that he studied here this last year. I figure a talk that's 40 minutes worms and 5 minutes flies, that's a right ratio. Because you guys, here, try to take this. Oh, you got to get, okay.
Yep.
Here's it. Because you guys get real bent out of shape when you see 20 or 30 face flies bothering your animals and 300 or so horn flies. You know, you get out there with whatever drugs ain't working, you treat like crazy. You can have 50,000, 100,000, 1 million worms in those same animals, no problem. Okay, that's part of your 5 minutes. You got less than 4 minutes now, come on.
And then he starts doing the countdown. Okay, so this is about 15 yards. There's 15 yards separation to the closest pasture, so they could not even have contact between the fence.
I don't want that.
You want this back?
No, I got this.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll be around after the talk for any additional questions for him or for me.
So fast, but
Yeah, okay.
so much
Yeah.
time.
Okay, so back to the important parasites, the worms. Here's what's happening inside the intestinal tract. Worms irritate and eat the lining of the intestinal tract, stimulates an immune response, shuts down what's called the Th1 immune response for the small intracellular parasites or pathogens, turns on the immune response for antibody production, also turns on the immune response for inflammatory reactions, so the Th2 and Th17 response gets augmented, fatigues the whole thing that's happening inside the animal. The effector cells get back to the intestinal lining. We have goblet cell proliferation, a lot of mucus production, a lot of inflammation. When these granulocytes rupture at the intestinal mucosal level, they cause a cleavage of the intestinal cells so that they come apart, and that leaks a whole bunch of fluid from the body into the intestinal tract. Basically, what the immune response is doing to worms, it's causing what's called a weep and sweep reaction. It's making the intestinal mucosa full of fluids, a lot of mucus. The worms can't hold on anymore. A little bit of antibody is getting to these worms. A little bit of cells are getting to those worms. So a whole bunch of stuff, a shotgun approach, is the best that worms get from an immune animal. And cattle never get completely immune to all the worms. There are some cattle that get pretty much protected, but the majority of cattle never get a very good immune response to worms. That's one reason why vaccines for worms is probably not going to happen in our future that we can see. Because cows vaccinate themselves for worms every day they eat out on that pasture. They get new worms every day. So it's not an exposure to the antibody or the antigens. It's just the immune response cannot get to where the worm is for an effective reduction. So that's what's going on. Now this illustrates that. These are sheep, infected sheep, non-infected sheep, very low levels of worms. Low levels of worms cause the small intestine to increase by 17% in weight. Abomasum to increase by 59% in weight. Large intestine to increase by 55%. That is just the tissue, the mucosal lining growing in response to the worms that are there. That's measuring the inflammatory response that a very few number of worms is causing. Here's a study done in Canada. Canadian dairy animals. You can't get less parasitized animals than Canadian dairy animals. They only got like 2 months of transmission up there for worms. And when you treated cattle up there, grazing cattle, dairy animals for worms, you increase the minutes they graze per day by 30 minutes per day. Just taking care of very low-level worms. And you increase the grazing jaw movements, GJMs. They had some sort of device on their mouths so you could tell how many times they chewed during the day, by 30 times per 10 minutes. Very low-level worms having a significant effect in dairy animals in Canada. Here's a great study that was done out of Oklahoma and Texas. They had cattle on pasture for 2 months before feed yard, and then they put them in feed yard for 118 days. And they either took care of them with fenbendazole on pasture or not, or they treated them with fenbendazole when they reached feed yard or not. And this is the amount of animals they treated for respiratory disease during feed yard. Respiratory disease. Viral. Not related to worms one little bit. But the less worms the animals had, the fewer animals had to get treated for respiratory disease. The more worms, the more susceptible they were to respiratory disease, and the more they needed medication. Worms, increasing the need for treatment for some other disease. Very common. And this is what treatment at feed yard did relative to improvement in these. And we're talking low-level worms. We're talking cattle, stocker cattle, that only had about 24 to 78 eggs per gram. I mean, that's nothing. I mean, I'll be happy with that. You're treating very low-level worms, and you increase feed efficiency by 4%. Dry matter intake, 8%. Total gain, 12% during feed yard. Incredible, low levels of worms. And we're all dealing with a lot more worms than that. Here's the level of worms that we have in our animals. Here's the age of the animal. And here's the levels of worms. We have the nematovirus. It's a calf foot disease. By the time an animal's 2 years of age, it doesn't get that disease anymore. It doesn't get that worm anymore. So that's the one age resistance to that one. That's the one worm that there's very good age resistance to. All the worms in the abomasum of the animal stay regardless of the age of the animal. Cows never get resistant to the worms in the abomasum, where the digestion of protein is going on. Small intestine basically cleans out. All those small intestine worms, the immune system eventually catches up with them and kicks them out of the animal. Here's what happens on your pasture every time you go into a grazing season. You start off with low egg counts, and increase, and then that's your summer worms, and then it decreases a little bit, and then you get your fall worms, and then down. That's how the egg counts vary in a pasture during a grazing season. The worms on the pasture, obviously they reflect the worms that came out in eggs from the feces. And the worms on pasture obviously translates into the worms in the animal. Eggs, larvae, worms in the animal. This is where you want to stop your worms here before they contaminate your whole herd, your whole pasture for the rest of the grazing season. Somebody gonna ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
May I ask now, is that continual grazing?
Yeah, you bet. Continuous grazing. Yeah.
Rotation?
I hate people ask questions about rotational grazing because the United States, y'all don't know how to do it. Okay, you got to be in Europe to know how to rotate. You have, if you rotate grazing and you keep your animals grazing more than 5 inches above the ground, you can rotate away from worms. But if once you get below that 5 inches, you're down where the worms are. And I've seen so many people try to rotate, and they usually rotate into the peak levels of larvae showing up. See, the masses of worms as they migrate up.
If it's up to their eyes, put them
Yeah.
and when you can see their nose.
The closer they're grazing, the more the worms are getting into. That's why sheep and goats get so many worms. Or right down, well, sheep anyways.
Okay,
You can't be a worm on a sheep pasture. They're going to find you.
If you do it correctly.
If you do it correct and stay above that 4 to 5 inches, right, great. Do that. Strip grazing, rotational grazing, you bet. Grazing older animals before you let younger animals get out there. Okay, let the older animals kind of kill off a little bit, the worms that are there, and then let your younger animals get that pasture after the cows leave it. There's age rotation. Some people practice different species of animals, horses. That's the only positive thing I can see about horses. If you can graze horses on a cow pasture, every worm it eats, it's killing it. Other than that, I can't see anything redeeming about horses. Okay, so rotation is good if it's done right, but I don't think anyone has ever done a research project where they've gone out to farms that claim they're doing an effective rotation and have seen good control. It's a common practice in Europe, but not in the United States. But having said that, we need something else. We need to do other things to get control of worms because drugs ain't doing it right now. The worms are too resistant to everything. So everything else you can put on the table to control worms, more power to you for doing it. And I appreciate you trying. Although I'd bet against it. Okay, so that's a trend of parasites on pet. Here's the level of worms in animals 2 years of age or younger, 2 years of age or older. We're only about 1/3 the worms when you get into older animals. Most of the worms are in the younger animals. Normal high egg count of a calf can get as high as 3,000 eggs per gram. I don't care how many worms you got in a cow, it's going to have an egg count of about 20. I don't care if you got 100,000 worms in that cow or 10,000 worms in that cow, it's going to have an egg count between 3 and 20 eggs per gram. So when we do studies to see how worm control is working, we do it with younger animals, not with cows. Worms like it brown, like it blue. They don't like it green so much. They don't like it low. They don't like all this other crap, which is precipitation. The more wet that pasture, the more they love it. And as you see, we're right in great moisture level for worms. They like it yellow and red, so they get the temperature-wise. They like nice temperature, nice and warm, a lot of moisture. Worms love that on pasture. Out here, we kind of run out of worms. Here's the life cycle. Worms are in the intestinal tract. Generally, males and females copulate. Eggs come out in the feces within a week. If the temperature is good, they go from the egg to the first, to the second, to the third stage larvae. The third stage larvae keeps a sheath on itself. It can't eat in the feces anymore. It migrates out onto the pasture, usually about a yard as far away as you can get from that fecal pad. And then it goes up on the grass. If there's moisture on that grass, it crawls negatively geotrophic. They crawl up on the grass and they hope to get eaten. And when the grass dries during the day, they migrate back down to where there is moisture. They keep on doing that for about 3 to 7 months. And then they just burn themselves out and die. So if you can keep animals off pasture for 3 to 7 months in the summertime, you're gonna kill 90% of your worms. If you dragged your pasture just before that, get that dung protection away from the worm. Expose it to the heat and the lack of moisture. Okay, so the worms get on the grass, get eaten. In about 3 weeks, they develop into adults. Stomach worms go to the stomach. Small intestine worms go to the small intestine. Large intestine worms go to large intestine. Lung worms go to the lung. Everybody knows exactly where to go, what to do when they get there. They copulate, lay eggs. They live for about 3 months, 4 months. Some of them can live for 7 months, and then they die. But every time that animal eats, it gets new worms in there to replace the ones that are dying. So that's the life cycle. Here's what the eggs look like. They come out in the feces. That's a hookworm egg, cattle. Strongyle egg. That's the majority of the eggs that come out of cows, a strongyle egg. You can't tell which genus of worm that is from the egg. You have to grow that egg into larvae. That's the thread-necked worm, Nematodirus. Those are tapeworm eggs. They have to get eaten by mites. That's a coxy. That's strongyloides. That's the only worm that we have in cattle that doesn't need a male. It's parthenogenetic female, has the next generation all by itself. Now, you said that tick didn't need any males.
They need a male,
They're parthenogenetic?
as far as I understand.
Crazy. Okay. Well, that's the only worm we got in cattle that only the female is parasitic. That's what the larvae look like. The tails look like the worms that crawl out of the feces you get on the grass. That's what a worm looks like when the animal eats it from the grass. Same worm 3 weeks later. Same worm 3 weeks later. All of that growth of worm was eating the intestinal tract, sucking the blood. All these worms eat the animal. None of them eat the animal's diet. Tapeworms eat the animal's diet. But worms and nematodes, roundworms, they only eat the animal and its blood. That's what the brown stomach worm looks like. I just tried to show some classy pictures for you, classy to me anyways. This is what worms look like that are healthy. Those are the first worms we found when we started to get macrocyclic lactose resistance. We found them like this. They were ghosts, but they were still in that animal. That's the beginning stages of resistance. That's what a whipworm looks like. Hookworms. Here's the life cycle of the liver fluke. Feces has to land in water. Stage migrates out of the feces, infects a snail. Snail has 2 generations of flukes inside it. They leave the snail, crawl out onto grass, and then the animal eats the grass. You have to have feces dissolved in water within 2 to 3 days. Otherwise, the life cycle gets broken. You have to have these snails as required intermediate hosts, and these snails require mud. So you got to have standing water, you got to have mud together in order to have good fluke infections in your pastures. Flukes, it's Johnny out the door. There is nothing you can do about flukes. Because the one drug that was effective, they yanked it off the market because no one was buying it. So now the 2 drugs that are claimed to have fluke activity, they only kill adult flukes. So they have to wait until a fluke is in your animal for 3 months, tearing up the liver, before you have a drug that's semi-effective against it. So it's even a worse case scenario with flukes than it is with roundworms. That's what the flukes look like. Tapeworm life cycle. Tapes inside the intestinal tract, proglottids come out, eaten by the mite, cow eats the mite, whole thing starts all over again. That's the tapeworm infection from one cow. Usually you get about, a good infection, you get about 10, 20 tapeworms. They serve like wallpaper in the intestinal tract. They hook on the intestinal tract and coat the intestinal lining and absorb the diet from whatever that animal ate. So not only are they taking the diet from the animal, they are cloaking part of the intestinal tract so that part of the intestinal tract doesn't work. You can do less for tapeworms than you can for flukes, and you can't do that much for flukes. There is no drug out there that's good for tapeworm infection. Okay, what do parasites do that make them successful? A 400-pound calf, a normal, low-level infection 400-pound calf will add 70,000 new worms to that pasture every day. There's an awful lot of worms getting on that pasture. They're protected in the dung. They're protected when snow covers them. They're protected by a sheath. They're motile. They're like fish. Am I getting close? 5 more minutes? I just started. Okay, let's get, what are we doing wrong out there? Wrong dose rate, milligrams per kilogram. Weigh your animals when you treat. Weigh your animals. We only have about 20% of our farmers in Arkansas got scales, and I'll bet only 10% of those scales work. Got it? If you do not give 100% of that effective dose, and you undercut it by 10%, you only give 90% of the dose, you are not getting any effect, and you're just conjuring up resistance, undercutting it just by 10%. Okay, wrong time for worming. Worms need a special time for treatment. There's always selection for resistance. What are the worms doing? They're doing a whole bunch of stuff in those animals to get resistant. What do you do when you buy a wormer? What are you going with? Price usually, formulation. Most people use pour-ons, although that's the worst way to give a wormer is a pour-on. The most effective way to give a wormer is down the throat. Second most effective way is injected. Topical, which most of you guys use, is the least effective way to get proper amount of medication to the worm. Salesperson, history, guy across the breakfast table, efficacy in animal performance. That's what you should be doing in order to choose your wormer. See if your wormer is working and see how well your animals are doing with that control. And here's the total package for worm control. Have a drug that's at least 50% effective, 90%. If you don't have 90% reduction in your fecal egg count, you are leaving at least 50% of your worms in that animal. You're going out there and you're deliberately just killing half the worms if you're not getting a good medication in them. Treat the animals when they deserve treatment, accurate treatment, herd health, and genetics. Okay. Really? He must have taken way too much time on those insects. Last time you do an insect talking. Okay. Is cow-calf operations where they don't have worm problems? Cow-calf operations where they do have worm problems? We treated half the cows at calving. We only got 6 pounds improvement in 90 days where they took care of their worms. Where they didn't take care of their worms, treating the mama cow in 90 days gave us 30 pounds more calf. And that's the cow. We're just treating the cow. I'm going to go back. Work done out of Argentina. Ivermectin, 18% fecal lake count. You got 2.4 pounds per day. Ricobendazole, 96%, 2.5 pounds a day. Levamisole plus ricobendazole, 100% efficacy, 2.6. The more efficacious your product, the more animal you get. Absolute. The more efficacious your product, the more animals you get. And I'm going to go all the way through this. Yep. Can't do it. Sorry about that. That was a long-term study we did with epinephrine long range. And then after we did a pasture study with it, we tried to use ivermectin, doramectin, and moxidectin on long-range pasture versus the other pastures. We found that one season using long range where we didn't go in and check egg counts allowed for reduction in efficacy across the board with all the other macrocyclic lactones. So if you give long-range product, you go out there and you took a look at those fecal samples 30 days post-treatment. If you're getting worms, eggs, in those feces 30 days post-treatment, those are all eggs from resistant worms. That is what you're seeding your pasture down with. My recommendation is combinations, especially with long range. Give long range with a benzimidazole and check 30 days later to see if you got eggs coming out. Not going to go there, not going to go there, not going to go there. It's all in the proceedings. Please, if you have any questions, yell at me. This is what we've done. From 1930s, we started with chewing tobacco, and now we got long range. That's all the products that came and went, and worms got resistant to them when they showed up. That's a level of efficacy of wormers in cattle, depending on cattle age. The younger animals is where we have the greatest depression of efficacy, because that's where the concentration of resistant worms and their biggest populations are, in those younger animals. The cooperiids, they have the most resistance, and that's where most of our medications fall down in efficacy. The stalker level is where we get the least amount of efficacy. What we're going to get more of, we might get more long-acting macrocyclic lactones. Maybe we're going to get Zolvix, which is a completely different class of product. Probably not. It should have been available years ago, but didn't show up. Right now, the latest thing that came out was bioworma. Maybe you've heard of that. It's a fungus, chlamydospores. You feed to cattle and sheep and horses and goats constantly, and the fungal spores get in the feces and they eat the larvae in the feces. Thing is, you got to give that to every animal on that pasture every day for at least 3 months to clean up that pasture of worms. That's what it looks like. It actually traps the larvae in the feces. The fungus reacts to worms within 15 minutes and traps them. A fungus. It's almost like it's waiting. Hopefully we're not going to get paintball machines that give dewormer out there. Unless you shoot flies with them. Individual flies with one paintball. Okay, and here's the worm your mama cow within 30 days of calving, worm your calves when you wean them, worm your replacements in your stalker cow, and your replacements on a cow-calf operation spring and fall, treat stalkers when you get them, and then 30 to 60 days later, and make sure you get an efficacious product. And there's a different kind of products and the yays and the nays of all of them, and that is how you find out if your drug is working. Those are the rules of finding out a fecal lake count reduction test. You need to get at least 90% fecal lake count reduction. If you don't, you're wasting your money with that dewormer. Right, what we're still working on, when you treat the nursing calf, if you do, attempting to skip animals to instill refugia, which means getting susceptible genes out there in our worms. Combinations are the way to go today. We don't have one good product, a standalone product. Combinations are the way to go, especially in younger animals. Cows, white dewormers probably are good. Cows. But the younger animals, combination product. should anthelmintics be veterinarian? And the last question that has to be answered, would worms vote Democrat or Republican? They'd probably stay home.
Or libertarian, right?
Don't send fecal samples with frozen vegetables as refrigerant because it tastes terrible at our end when we get it. I mean, and don't put them in biohazard bags. That makes inspectors at the post office really upset when you got biohazard bags in the mail. And I'm done. And I'm sorry, I didn't get to the crux of my presentation. And thank you very much for coming.
Let's take the questions. We have time for one question. Somebody has a burning question for Dr. Yazwinski.
Yeah.
What about switching wormers on a cow operation every year? Does some do better on others?
I think the time has come and gone on that. Okay. I really do. And when you, switching wormers season to season on a particular farm, if you stay within the macrocyclic lactone group, you're not switching. So you got doramectin, ivermectin, epinomectin, cydectin, they're all the same. They're all the same. Worm is seeing the same thing. Cydectin, a little bit more efficacious, but not that much, okay? So that's no switching. And the time to switch was when you still got good control. We're not getting any control in the younger animals with just those macrocyclic lactones. So younger animals, combination. Older animals, the white dewormer. And hope we get a new product out. But I'm not looking at anything new. And I see them 5 years before they show up. So you're at least 5 years away using these drugs that ain't working today. So I'm sorry about that. I mean, you chose cattle farming. And I thank you. I thank you very much for doing that. Yeah.
Dr. Yazwinski, will you be around?
Yeah, I'll be around for an hour or so afterwards.
We'll go ahead and take an opportunity then if you need to ask Dr. Yazwinski some other questions, he'll be around for a while, and you can find him, and now would be a convenient time to do that as we transition into the trade show break. We're going to be back in here